This is Life Worlds, the place where we explore life through other eyes and minds. Let's flip the script and discover how to orient your world around nature. I'm Alexa Firminish. Come join me as we get down and forage for fungi, stalk coyotes, draft laws for rivers, hum with beehives, sing bird language, and help beavers to dam again. Let these stories spark your reconnection to nature's multiverse. Learn how to bring ecosystems back to life, become an agent for other intelligences, and begin to see how you too are the sum of all life worlds. Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of Life Worlds. In today's episode, we're going to be exploring the landscape of a very particular human emotion and skill set, and it's something that we call empathy. Now, the word empathy actually stems from a Greek word originally, empatheia, which translates into in feeling or passion. The word was then used in Germany in the 1800s, but mostly in aesthetics to describe the way you might project your feeling into a landscape or a portrait. And it was really in the early 1900s, in English, that the word empathy began to be more used in its modern sense of the term. And this moment marked a shift where it was originally feeling in art forms, into really feeling into other beings. And from there, we have the seed of the modern psychological meaning of empathy. And so over the last century or so, empathy has evolved also into an ethical concept. It's now really seen as our capacity to enter into another's subjective world, to understand their world from within. And in philosophy, it's taken on the dimension of a sort of ethical imagination. So how can we imagine and feel the ethics, the morals of being with others, feeling with others, and bridging between the self and the other? And so empathy it goes beyond sympathy, which is sort of feeling for you, right? It's really feeling from within. And it's very much an art and a muscle, a way we can learn on a daily basis to inhabit the world from the inside out. Now, those of you who have been listening to the podcast for a little while will know that empathy is at the heart of what we've been exploring here. Life worlds or life worlding, which I prefer it because it's a verb. Life worlding is a result of, and is actually perhaps the act of empathy, of placing ourselves within another to brush up against what it might be like for me to inhabit your world. And as I say on the website, it's through this doorway of inhabiting multiple perspectives that we begin to heal our modern culture that is so steeped and immersed in duality and all of the pain that we inflict on ourselves and others because of that disconnection. If you think of war, ecological destruction, numbness, apathy, it all emerges from a fractured mindset. And we need empathy to resensitize our perception to the world, to sort of feel the world again after a long anesthesia, a long period of sleeping. And so I really do believe that any practices that we can find to help our society practice empathy are just critical and so sorely needed. And that's why today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Dylan McGarry, who is one of the founders of Empatheatre, a methodology for empathy and for collective transformation, and one that has very much completely captivated my attention recently. Empatheatre is a South African theatre making company that acts as a sort of public storytelling collective. Through their plays, they sculpt new social spaces that act as amphitheatres for empathy and also for public dialogue. And through all of this kind of work, they bring a multiplicity of voices to light. One can say that they shape the invisible material of empathy. And their collective has been responsible for launching several groundbreaking theatre projects over the last decade, including one called Soil and Ash that focuses on rural communities that face pressure from mining companies, Urwembu, which speaks about street-level drug addiction, The Last Country, which speaks about female migration stories, and Lalela Urwanle, which is an international project we'll talk a bit about today that looks at the governance of our oceans, our collective oceans all around the world. And what I found by digging into their work is that this kind of restorative public storytelling allows them to amplify a chorus of voices, and particularly voices of marginalized groups. And the beauty of this being framed as an art practice versus maybe, let's say, a conference or other types of meetings, it enables participants to occupy what's called a third space. And that third space enables them to sort of suspend our usual modus operandi or default ways of being in the world, because art, myth, and these kinds of embodied practices, they enable a lot of other voices to come forth. And these voices have often been excluded from legal or academic or policy forums. And it makes everyone much more comfortable to start a conversation about a challenging or divisive topic. If you look at how the plays are actually structured, I find the process incredibly fascinating. It begins with months of story listening, so interviews, oral histories, digging through the archives, before any script is actually written. And in that process of story listening or research, the participants and partners really work together to identify the main matters of concern and the pressing questions. The first iterations of the script are then written, and the scenes are mirrored back to the communities. In that mirroring, there are dialogues that ensue, and the play is refined through that dialogue. And then it's rolled out again and performed to strategic audiences that include everyone from corporate leaders to local activists. And they really ensure that these audiences are made up of people with different levels of agency, of power, and of privilege in relation to the matter that's being viewed and discussed. And it's important in those contexts to even have conflicting views on the central concern. In this way, each performance kind of becomes a living research lab, and it's followed by open conversations and post-play dialogues that ripple out into policy and governance. And the effect of doing this is that the research and the plays move into direct contact with real-world governance and policy processes. And the research becomes itself a practice of empathy and co-create stories that shape new spaces. Another key point that I find very compelling here is that today many important discussions that decide the fates of our society are done behind closed-door meetings, or very corporate-esque meetings. And their frameworks represent mostly the voices of science and economics. Now, Empatheatre insists that new spaces of listening and dialogue must be invented, that stories and rituals and ancestral knowledge must stand alongside science and economics in shaping governance. And so in this way, empathy isn't just a soft skill, but it's also an infrastructure of democracy and democratic processes and thinking. So in a way, Empatheatre is really a method of conducting research on key topics and publicly interrogating that research. It's about social justice and democratizing the ways in which we surface and co-create knowledge. Before we dive into the conversation with Dill, I want to share a few of their plays just to share how powerful these methods can be. So their play Soil and Ash was a Thutu. So the play Soil and Ash was a Zulu theatre piece addressed at issues of rural development and social justice around mining in South Africa. And what the play did was that it enabled quite an internally divided community of residents to navigate difficult conversations around the proposed mine without resorting to personal attacks on one another. By echoing both the present-day realities and future concerns of the residents, and by carefully considering the opposing stances without judging one over the other, it worked towards offering a more sustainable and long-term solution. A very vivid example of art holding contradiction without collapsing into polarity. And so when I think about all the other communities and landscapes that face similar dilemmas, the pull between livelihood and extraction, I really, really get inspired by how these methods could travel. Another piece that I think is incredible was the listening train, which was in 2011. They spent 44 days aboard a train that traversed South Africa, known as the Climate Train. And it was a collaborative social mobilization initiative that created an alternative to the traditional conference space of COP17, the big climate conferences. And as it moved through the land, the train created exchanges between over 8,000 people across the country. And it was carrying poets and filmmakers and gardeners and educators. And they created spaces of dialogue and artifacts from these discussions that were brought into the climate arena. And just finally, Lalela Ulwandle, which is translated from Zulu as Listen to the Sea, is another theatre piece that really made visible the stories of the ocean that are seldom heard or seen in the public domain. It contained the voices of small-scale fishers, academics, marine scientists, healers, religious followers, activists, and through their stories recounted how the ocean is linked to various livelihoods, medicine and healing, and also linked to awe and wonder and to spiritual connections with ancestors. And astoundingly, one of the artworks from this process, we'll talk about it today, became the first animated film to be used successfully in South Africa in court for a case against a company that was about to mine the South African deep sea for oil and gas. Like, how exceptional is that artifacts from these artistic aesthetic processes can actually be used practically for legal jurisprudence? So we'll touch on various of these plays today, as well as new productions they have in the making, drum roll, on animal sentience, communication, and the whales. We've had quite a few whales on the show recently, whale-themed episodes. And Dill will share the three key parts he sees in empathetic practice, which are imagination, attentiveness, and intuition. We'll explore how empathy can counteract systemic disconnection, how to listen across species divides, how art enables us to cross thresholds into other beings' perspectives, and the kinds of stories that, when they are told into the world, pierce us so deeply back in return, and that change the teller as much as the listener. This is definitely a Trojan horse approach to transformation, and I love it for that. Over to the episode. Dylan, good morning. Hello. Welcome to Life Worlds.
Good morning. So good to see you.
It's such a pleasure to see you. And we had the joy of being in each other's presence just a few weeks ago. And I participated in also one of your workshops, which we'll get to later in this episode. I just want to say, and it's obvious that's why you're on the show, but I am so enthralled by the work that you do and your approach and what you and your team have really sort of pioneered in the space of theatre and civil discourse and justice. I was watching the video on your website just earlier, sort of looking at it again, and even just I got so teary-eyed, like watching the communities like making props, and making their own tools, and the way that like people are so empowered locally as well. And I think where I want to kick us off is right in the name of Empatheatre. And so Empatheatre, empathy. And you said in your PhD, which by the way is such an interesting read, you wrote, "The tangible capacities that I have found that are most needed to encourage reconnection are primarily those that enable empathy and imagination." And so, I think we've discussed this a bit in person, but in today's society, so many people are numbed, and indeed they don't feel, and we don't feel our entanglement with the wider whole, other humans or the earth. And so I'm really keen to understand from you how empathy can sort of counteract this anesthesia. You actually use a term I liked called ecological apartheid, and how it can resensitize our perception. It obviously goes without saying that that's a cornerstone of the podcast, like Life Worlds, is how to inhabit the perspective of others. So maybe we can just start off. What have you learned about empathy, and specifically how empathy can counteract disconnection?
Yes, I mean, the empathy really in that work, at least when I was doing my PhD, which it's quite some time ago. So obviously it's progressed a lot in the Empatheatre work. But in the time that I wrote that, I was realizing that I was very inspired by the artist Joseph Beuys, who described the kind of that there's invisible materials between us and each other and the more than human world, and that these could be sculpted. So my question really was like, how do I shape this invisible material of empathy? Is it possible to kind of expand it and shape it and direct it? But then obviously as I explored it more, I realized just how important there were kind of three key parts of empathy that needed to be sculpted. And the one was imagination. So it takes a lot of imagination to actually be in the space of the other, whether it's human or more than. And for me, the imagination was a key component. But in order to be truly imaginative, you needed to feed your imagination with two sources. Like two rivers need to feed into it. And the one was attentiveness, to just be attentive and with all your senses. And in that thesis, I was also looking at like Steiner's 12 senses, that you have inner senses, outer senses, and relational senses. And he described 12, not 6, that you could draw from to kind of really expand your attentiveness to a situation. But the other was intuition. And by that, I mean both the hocus pocus one and intuition, which is kind of in educational sociology is more kind of defined as the beingness and the place from which you come and your life experience. So your beingness, your ontology, and then the place that you come from, the kind of epistemology. So intuition can also be described as the kind of living encyclopedia, the living encyclopedia that is your body, that you can, and your experience, that you can draw and feed your imagination. So in that work, I was realizing that how we can use empathy we can expand empathy by drawing from our attentiveness, our imagination, and our intuition. And these three forces allow us to stay even more present. And then since then, I've expanded that obviously with others. And the fourth kind of part is the echolocation or the relational capacities. That when we take those three things and we start bouncing them off with the world and listening and calling and responding, then it gets even more profound. And your empathy no longer becomes something that you hold just inside yourself. It obviously becomes this material, the social tissue that you, and social, I don't just mean with the human, but with the more than human world, you can expand it. And so that brings us full circle to this question of ecological apartheid, which was in the title of my thesis, which I'd got from Cormac Cullinan, who was a kind of informal mentor during my PhD. He's a more than human lawyer. And yeah, I'd noticed that I wanted to understand what is an education for the ecological citizen in that work, and what kinds of new kind of pedagogies and curriculum and practices do we need in order to respond to this separation, this apartheid that we've experienced between ourselves and nature, which was particularly fitting because there's actual environmental racism and actual ecological apartheid in the country I grew up in. So there was a dynamic to that work that then became and was always quite political, alongside the kind of deep personal. I don't know if that kind of sums it up or responds.
I feel like we could do an entire episode on imagination, on attentiveness and intuition and echolocation. I feel each of these. I actually, a little bit later, I want to get into speaking one of your pieces and the part on imagination and aesthetics, but I've never heard, these different currents, if you will, or these parts that bring us towards empathy. And so, you've worked with so many different types of communities and stakeholders, and you've brought them into practices, whether that's, being part of the theater or being part of discussion groups. In that sort of initial work of looking through the perspectives of others, whether it's other humans that may seem very counter-ethical to who we are, or other beings, what practices do you maybe bring people through, or what practices have you seen help people shift into that perspective quite practically? Like what works and what doesn't? And like maybe that is a question of like how these different 3 or 4 parts land in practice.
Yes. You know, I think the thing that always really works are images, and the relationship between images and stories. So whether it's theater or it's visual art or sculpture, um, I, the power of connective aesthetics always seems to work. And I think because we sometimes language is so wonderful and so beautiful, but it often sometimes fails us, because it can sometimes keep us in our camps. And growing up in a country with like 11 official languages, you also draw from other ways of communicating and other ways of learning from each other. And also the power of just storytelling. There, people drop into a kind of, Rumi's field, or beyond all right doing and wrong doing. There's a field. Let's meet there. There's a third space that I find that art practice allows us to occupy, even if we are in disagreement. And so we've really experimented over the last, in my career over the last 20 years, but in Empatheatre over the last like 12, 13 years, we've explored what that could look like using theater, animation, film, exhibitions, even virtual reality. And yeah, it really does. Aesthetics, the role of aesthetics and connective aesthetics always comes down to, for me, is the kind of core practice that brings us together.
So let's say you have like some, perceived perpetrator of a harm, whether it's an extractive industry executive or a police officer that maybe has been seen to create a harm against the community. And then you have the other side of that experience in the room as well. Or like with the play you did on human wildlife conflict with the baboons, and I think it was baboons or monkeys, right? Yeah.
Yes, baboons. Yeah.
If we're going from this premise of sort of image stories, and I loved what you had in one of your papers. You spoke about story listening before storytelling, and this two-handled spade where people co-define matters of concern, and you sort of collaboratively define those things together. So it's like the listening and the story, which goes back to the attentiveness piece, probably. Like, how do you even kick off when that tension is in the room, and how would you get people to embody perspective that may seem so really just like physically unwelcome to them?
I love that you said you focused on story listening, because the story listening really, before we have people in a room together, we would have done a lot of work listening to everyone's perspectives, sometimes for 18 months to 2 years or longer. And trying to understand and lay out the conflict, the context, and the concerns as best we know how. So that's through all kinds of processes of listening. So oral histories, interviews, archival research. So there's a lot of kind of quite rigorous listening. So that when we finally have brought people into a room, we would have gone through a whole process, which I can get into detail about, but a whole process that is not just us, but a collaborative, democratic process of us kind of being bumblebees going around listening to everyone's experience of this concern, crafting something. Usually it's a theater production. And even in the crafting of that, there's iterative cycles where audience members and people who have different levels of agency and power in relation to that concern have had feedback into it. That you get to a point where you've got a production, people have sit down for an hour and a half. And the thing that happens in a lot of civic spaces or civil discussion, assemblies or public meetings, is that people come under their arm with their agenda, ready to kind of throw at the room. And what we realized is that we needed to try find a way to soften that. Of course, there's room for your agenda, but let's all just spend time story listening to each other, and then let's have a discussion. And so what ends up happening, for example, we had a production called Olwembu, The Web, in a Zulu play set in Durban around street level drug addiction and homeless youth. Just to say that our plays, we never know what play we're going to make. The plays surface from concerns of communities, and this was a very key concern. But there's like a kind of spider web of interactions that leave certain people very vulnerable. And we realized we didn't just need a pedagogy for the oppressed, for the vulnerable in this, like Paulo Freire's idea. We also needed a pedagogy for the oppressor. We needed to think about the people and the systems that were causing violence to young people on the streets. And so there's a scene in the play that's quite difficult in which the main mother character that Mpumi plays, my co-founder of Empatheatre, she plays a mother who's a policewoman who becomes hardened by the system. And then she kind of practices this violent policing practice on the streets, which normally ends up on young people. And in the play, we eventually had almost 3 years into touring this play, we eventually got in the room the commissioner of police, the local colonel, police officers, street level drug users, homeless youth, social workers, psychologists, and Department of Health officials, all in one room. They watch the same play. They have the same experience. And there's a scene finally where the mother is about to practice this violent kind of system that we'd seen in the police. And she discovers that when she lifts up the hoodie, that it's her own son. And so one way we do this is we take the complexities of the world outside and we place them in the experience of a person. In a story, you can do that. And so you can take, if we really are one organism and we are one community, creating an inner conflict in a person is much more relatable. So we kind of take the audience into a process of embodying complexity of the world inside themselves. And we can really relate to a mother who's done a thing a certain way her whole life, or increasingly done a violence, and then suddenly realizes, oh gosh, I'm being violent when it's her own son. Would I actually do this practice if it was my own child? And so what we had at the end of the show was the colonel of the police system there stood up in the post-show dialogue. So after every play, there's this opportunity for dialogue, and it sometimes becomes a tribunal. It sometimes becomes a citizen assembly. In this one, it really became a tribunal, and the whole audience is the judge or the jury. And the colonel challenged us and said, this scene is incorrect. My police officers don't do this. You can't be perpetuating this bad publicity for the police. But then a very young, brave person who's homeless, who lives on the street, stood up and said, actually, sorry, sir, this does happen. It happened to me yesterday, and the officer who did it is in the room. But rather than pointing at the officer, they pointed at the play, and they pointed at Mpumi. So there was this redirection of finger pointing into the story. And the third space of the play allowed for people to kind of grapple with a difficulty together and kind of share a bit more responsibility of them. Anyway, it's a much more complicated story, but from that, the police, through another process and with incredible social worker and sociologist, Monique Marks, who had connected us with the police, we had done 2 years of undercover work with the police and drug users in the city. We then had the police shifting their arrest quotas and changing some of their systems to avoid this very particular problem. And yeah, I think what was really powerful about that moment was that when people can really see themselves portrayed, but sometimes in a satirical way or in a not in this pathological way, but in using pathos and humor and meaning and image, there's a kind of a third space in which you can occupy and grapple with these things together. And we found that to be really powerful. And that kind of is why we called ourselves Empatheatre, is that, yes, we're using theatre, but we're actually trying to sculpt an amphitheatre of empathy, that the actual amphitheatre is the empathy that the group starts conjuring and sculpting together over the hour and a half or 90 minutes of the play and then the post-show dialogue. And we've realized that this can actually be very powerful for organizations, for NGOs, for building understanding and deepening empathy across difference.
I so love that, Dylan. It's what you said in the beginning about like sculpting the invisible material, and this idea that theater, I think, has always served that like third space, right? Of like also all of our like taboos and all of our like illicit longings. And like we love to go to theater because it's a space where we can like inhabit the parts of us on stage that we don't necessarily give light of day to because of our, personal or cultural context. Um, and that sense of like the redirection onto the third space, it also makes me think a little bit about like family constellations or these therapy processes where like people start to embody and inhabit parts of your own, whether it's family or your own internal world, and there's something about having it displayed. And I guess I'd be curious as a practitioner. Well, it also makes me think that empathy isn't about agreement, it's actually more about creating vessels to hold these conflicting perspectives. So it's not like, oh, if we empathize, we agree. It's more, there's a way of talking about and relating to it. Um, how do you find like this shows up kind of in your body? Like, how do you know personally that you've come to inhabit someone else's perspective or another being's perspective? Like, in your own experience of it, how do you know when you're there?
Maybe I should answer this in two ways. The first is I don't think we ever truly there. I think I don't know which, I think it's James Joyce. I can't remember what poet, but he talks about the infinite algebra of oneself, that it's like this almost impossible equation. Like it takes so long to even just know ourselves. It takes a whole lifetime or like karmic generations upon generations and to fully understand who we are. So I don't think we can ever truly understand the other. But I think empathy is a creative act. It's imaginal. It's an art making practice that even just listening you're creating a picture and a life world of the other inside yourself in order to get closer to each other. So I think it's just like it's a coming closer, but never truly. And that's what's so wonderful, because another person is just always so deeply mysterious, even if you've lived together for your whole lives, and there's still always so much to know, and we're always changing. So, we realize this, but I think you know that you're getting somewhere when something inside of you is feeling like it's changing. So in that same paper with the two-sided spade, the last image that I used to kind of describe a kind of suitably strange pedagogy for living in these times is Ben Okri's double-sided axe. So Ben Okri describes like a story, a good story that you send out into the world or you cut into the world must cut you back in return. It's like your heart must also be cut. And also the stakes of telling stories are very powerful, and you will be changed. When you get gifted a story or someone else's story, we have found that we are deeply changed as a team. And sometimes some of our projects are so difficult that we actually have to have a therapist on call with us just to process what the stories we are hearing. Because the one we're working at the moment right now on environmental defenders who are being assassinated to try to stop coal mines, for example. We grew up in the assassination capital of South Africa. It's very painful, very difficult stories. We already, after this week, we really feel that we are changing. So I think if there's almost sometimes an affect, so that pre-verbal experience or feeling in your body, sometimes it's like, good satire must make you feel really uncomfortable. You must like sweat a little bit and laugh, So, in our play Unruly, there's a lot of satire because we are looking at kind of white privilege in the space of conservation and in the complexities of South Africa. You must feel a little bit uncomfortable because your perspective is shifting. But at the same time, you must also feel maybe tears emerge or a lump in your throat. And like kind of noticing what's happening in your body can always be a good sign that maybe empathy is growing, or at least an understanding of the other is shifting. And we do use, the human body is the most precise scientific instrument. No matter how sophisticated our telescopes or microscopes become, the light still enters a human eye and a human body having a human experience. And so, yeah, noticing what's happening in your body is often for us one of the most key instruments we use to understand like it's working. We've made plays which we've obviously watched like thousands of times over when we're touring. But we know a scene really works when we cry each time that scene happens, or we laugh, even though we've heard that joke a million times. There's something in the room that everyone is feeling and is affected by. So the difference between affect and affect, that your body is responding.
I love that answer. It almost, I feel like the play is like this like living organism that like keeps taking its own form. There was something else that you shared, and if we move on to sort of the part on aesthetics and imagination, and some people that listen to this show, they work in policy or governance or law and in the environmental space. So I'm going to bring us now towards a little bit of some of the works that you've done, how they've affected those rooms. But before going there, you speak about the aesthetic practices, so theater, poetry, sculpture. And you mentioned in one of your papers tactile theory, which is that theories must be felt and sculpted. So learning is not abstract, but is sensorial. And that's very much what we've been talking about, right? So how do all the approaches we've just described contrast with how we generally see experts in governments working with things like biodiversity collapse or social injustice? This often happens in like narrow conference halls, as you've spoken to. So how do you think that the way that we meet and gather and quote unquote problem solve could be improved by what you've seen? I mean, you've created trains and, play like animations. So speak a little bit to how that overlaps with that world.
I think what's so funny is that humans create all these systems and all these, even law and policy. It's all imagined. It's all something we made up as humans. It's all a story. Every legal system is also just a story. And so all law emerged out of customary law, LORE. So all LAW, this I learned from the amazing legal anthropologist Saskia Vermeulen, where LAW was originally LORE, law, folklore. And so law emerged out of stories. So once you realize that no matter if it's the United Nations, a windowless decision-making theater in the United Nations, or boardroom, or, a protest, all law is this collective imagined project that can be reimagined. And so, and that it's human beings always in the room, no matter how fancy they dress or, how big their like bank accounts are, they're still human beings that dream and need to go to the bathroom and, are like tired and need a cup of coffee. So I think that was really helpful for us, is that, and almost every human being appreciates art and is moved in some way. The problem with a lot of those spaces is that they're kind of body blind to their own histories of how they were created, and they are very textual based. So a lot of legal processes also rely on very small amounts of information, like sound bites, to, things get whittled down and whittled down and whittled down and rarefied and rarefied and rarefied until they're almost so abstract that they can't really live in the world. Kind of like how we refine and make oil, it becomes this kind of toxic thing. And what we always want to do is bring people back to the context. So my amazing supervisor and teacher, Professor Hela Lotsa-Sitka, she talks about ontological collapse. So this idea that your ontology, your being, when it's removed from context and removed from the place and all the rich stories and textures and tapestries of your life, and universalized into an idea or a law or universal principle. She calls it ontological collapse, that it all collapses because you haven't connected it to that world. So we found the power of aesthetics in those spaces is that we try to carry as much of the world with the point we're trying to make. And the problem with a lot of policy systems is you make the point, but the feeling and the affect and the emotions and the memory and the history and even the kind of longing of the ancestors is not in the room with that point. So what we try to do is try to carry as much as we can. And you can do that with theater and animation and some other art-based forms. You can carry some of that life world with you into that room. And so we've had incredible encounters like it with a UN British for the UK government negotiator for the climate COP. We had one woman who watched the show, our play La Lelo Lwantle, which is around ocean governance. And she said this was after 25 years of negotiating in climate COP. This was the first time she felt like her soul could show up in that space. And I think, we need to find ways to bring our full selves into these. And also theater allows you to do long form storytelling. And it's kind of like the medicine to this kind of refined, small point that you make. Sometimes people only get 5 minutes to make a point in those decision-making theaters. But we've been able to bring those same people into a room and spend 90 minutes together, understanding and seeing the whole world and the feeling and the context of all the different points we're trying to make. And so, there's a power to that. And a kind of disruptive power. It's like, we call it in social learning, optimal disruption. You wanting to disrupt the system just right. You don't want to overdo it. And the thing about theater and art is that people are a bit willing to be disrupted when it's art. And so it's kind of like a Trojan horse. You can get a lot of things into a system through art that you just couldn't if you wrote a policy brief. Because I've tried that route. I've written lots of policy briefs and they fall flat. But then when I submitted a play as a policy brief, it changed law.
This has been such a big insight for me, getting to know you and the work. And for me, one of the biggest insights that I received from sort of going through your work is that it's actually structural violence to debate and work on environmental and social issues in the way that we do. Because those rooms are so alienating and dissociated from how many people from different cultural contexts, not just the global south, not just indigenous people, but children, ancestors, elders, is just so disconnected from their own life world and experience of the world. And in one of your papers you were about like inclusion as tokenism, but it's like, they're included, they're here, but their way of relating isn't like bullet points and it isn't policy briefs. And so I would love, maybe it would be through the Listen to the Sea play that I won't try to say it in Zulu because I'll embarrass myself, but maybe you could share how in that case you broke down that boundary and allowed the voices of the ocean, the voices of the ancestors to be present in quite like, how will I say, quite a pragmatic way as well. And that the spiritual and cultural heritage was brought in and led to a very practical real world outcome, which I love, that kind of mixing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So Lalelo Olwantle means listen to the sea in isiZulu. And it emerged from, so we have an amazing critical race sociologist, Dr. Kira Owen, who helped us create Empatheatre in the beginning. She was my supervisor for my postdoc. And she was called to kind of facilitate a public meeting where PASA, the Petroleum Association of South Africa, and the lawyers and the government had to do a community consultation in Durban, where we grew up, on the east coast of South Africa, around a future oil and gas exploration in the deep sea. And she noticed something really concerning, is that many people in the community of this province actually had reasons why they didn't want this oil and gas mining off their coastline. And it was a big Italian company at the time, called ENI. But in these processes, they were it was seen as the petrochemical company versus community, as if that community was one homogenous group that had one way of looking at this. It was like, just no, we're against the oil, gas, but there was no depth. And we could see how the conversation and the town hall meetings were collapsing because there was this kind of homogenous looking at community. And to also assume that the petrochemical company and the government had equal power and there was parity between these two groups. So we wanted to problematize that. And so we started listening to stories up and down the coastline of South Africa. And we found that there were so many reasons, very different reasons, sometimes even coming from very conflicting cosmologies and worldviews, that led to why people didn't. So if you were a surfer and if you were Sangoma, a traditional healer in South Africa, you both didn't want the oil and gas, but for very different reasons. And so we felt like, let's tell a story about those different reasons. So the play begins, we have three characters in that play. It's a grandmother white woman who's an old marine scientist, retired marine scientist, who's grieving the loss of her husband. A middle-aged Zulu woman who Mpumi plays, who comes from a long line of traditional healers, but is now a marine educator. And then a young Indian man. This Durban has the largest Indian community outside of India, from indentured slave workers coming long ago, who's a young activist, but the son of a fishing community. And the play, it's kind of like three monologues interwoven into each other. And you start seeing the diversity of experiences that people have. This, by the way, is a radio play, and anyone listening can listen to it on our website, empatheatre.com. Just lalelo wantle, listen to the scene. You can actually listen to the 4-hour play. But what emerged in that process was we held tribunals and citizen assemblies over 2 years up and down the coastline, in town halls and churches and soccer fields. And from those, we surfaced 800 testimonies of different reasons why people didn't want this. And we had support from the One Ocean Hub and Elisa Morguera, as a human rights lawyer, who helped Natural Justice and other NGOs in South Africa, the Legal Resource Centre, actually submit these testimonies that had emerged from our theatre process into the responses against this oil and gas. By that point, the system collapsed and they didn't go, the ENI pulled out. It became too complicated for them to go ahead with the exploration. But as we were going, an amazing scholar activist, an old friend of mine, Taryn Pereira, was following the play, and she was building, with the audience afterwards, a solidarity network called the Coastal Justice Network, which was mostly led by artisanal and indigenous small-scale fishers who had experienced really horrific impact from apartheid. And that a lot of the laws that governed small-scale fishers along the coastline still had this kind of haunting from the apartheid system. And so we realized that the play actually could do other work beyond just responding to this oil and gas. It could actually build solidarity. And so more stories were coming up after each performance, which Taryn and the Coastal Justice Network team, which is a network of activists and scholar activists and fishers and others, could respond and start building. And so as the years progressed, another oil and gas exploration was coming onto the coastline on the further south. And this was now Shell, the big oil and gas giant. Lots of money, lots of power. And the government had given rights for exploration without consulting many communities. And so a court case of these small-scale fishers took the government to court with the help of Natural Justice and the Legal Resource Centre and Wild Law with Cormac Cullinan. They made a case against Shell and the government on this. Before we had got involved in this, the first case didn't work, and they lost the case because the argument was just environmental. they hadn't really brought in the intangible heritage question. But in the second case, when they appealed, they were able to put in these incredibly rich testimonies of small-scale fishers, of the many reasons, from their livelihoods to the presence of the ancestors. And so this all happened also through COVID, and we couldn't do theatre through the period of COVID. So we also took one of the stories from the play and made an animation called Indlela Yokopila, The Soul's Journey, which tells the story of a cosmological rendering, a kind of reincarnation story that's connected with the water cycle, which you can also watch online. It's on YouTube, on our Empatheatre YouTube page. And so we had an early draft of that, and we had the script, and that was also submitted in the case record for this case, alongside the fishers' testimonies. And the fishers won, and I really think it was definitely mainly because of their testimonies, but it helped to have theatre and animation to support and allow the judge to go through that and experience what this means, that the ancestors lived in the sea. And his judgment was the first judgment in South Africa that made this very clear connection to even acknowledging the presence of the ancestors. And he says it's not the case of this court to argue whether there's ancestors in the ocean or not, but it is this court to protect the people who have a deep sacred bond to the ocean because the ancestors are there, the Amadlozi. And over and above that, it was also the first time art was used in evidence in a court case in South Africa. And so they won that case. And then recently, a month ago, they won another case using the similar evidence for another region where now Total and Shell and some other oil and gas companies are also trying to source oil and gas in the deep sea. But it's had other policy impact beyond just that legal case. We've been able to support policy processes around marine spatial planning, around MPAs, the kind of apartheid legacy of MPAs of forced removals of people from their coastal villages to make space for conservation without consultation. So reparative work around that, as well as Mpumi has just got back from early this month for her second United Nations address, where she was able to perform Indlela live in a UN assembly, and it's now informing the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction policy. So all the areas in the ocean that are beyond countries' jurisdictions, that are the collective, that are United Nations is responsible for, we're now supporting policy change with that. Sorry, that was a long response, but that's kind of one of the ways of that Lalelo Lwandle and Indlela Yokopila could contribute to that shift.
I get quite emotional actually hearing these stories. Because when I think about healing, like this feels truly healing, because it's supporting actions on the ground, but it's reweaving communities. It's making the invisible voices, quote unquote, visible. And it's interesting in that it's both elegant and radical. And I feel like a lot of like the activist-y stuff is very radical, but it doesn't have necessarily always like the cultural, textural, social nuance of what you're bringing. And it doesn't always weave. It doesn't kind of, not that, as I said before, not that empathy means everyone has to agree, but it doesn't create a new form of dialogue or synthesis or emergent outcome. It can be quite conflicting. And then I also find that a lot of art can be absolutely stunning if you're, seeing it in the street or in the gallery, but then it doesn't connect necessarily to the real world, but it doesn't necessarily connect to changes on the ground that actually support communities to have their sovereignty and their agency. So I'm so struck by this weaving, and I can imagine even probably people listening are like, oh my gosh, this could apply for everything, everything I'm working on or thinking about or doing. And you're speaking about one case of extraction of one country's coastline with different communities. And I'm just struck by like, how could the world be if a sort of, multiplicity of these things were happening at once and happening together. And I think it has incredibly wide implications. So just really, really commending that. I would love to talk about whales, which is you've got a whalebone in your background. You've got a whale as your WhatsApp picture, um, and your new book that's coming out is called Pedagogies of Echolocation. I know that speaks to a wider thing, but obviously the whales are also the ones that do very much echolocate, along with the bats and some of the others. We both really admire the late Karen Backer. She was on this podcast as well, speaking to bioacoustics. And I think we share a concern around the ethical implications of developments in technology allowing us to speak across species divides. And this kind of work has massive implications for conservation, for protection of different species, and people can go to that episode to get into more of that. But we also have mutual friends, Dill, with the More Than Human Rights Project out of NYU and Project SETI. And so there is this potential future that's maybe not so speculative, right? Where people are testifying on behalf of whales in courts, or whales are somehow using the language and the translation of whales is used in court as a form of interspecies justice or democracy. And a lot of questions come up around safeguards, guardrails, practice, protocols. And you're actually going to be developing a new play on this topic. So maybe you can share a bit about what your process will be for it, and the main questions that you're asking when it comes to this life world interaction with the whales and how they'll interface with our political and economic systems.
Yes, I mean, I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to make this play. I have a deep connection with whales since I was very young. I never really recovered from the story of Jonah or Pinocchio. And so I found this idea of being swallowed by whales so extraordinary. You know, they are both womb and tomb. You know, heroes from many different cultures, from Pakir, from Aratoa to Manu in Hindu mythology. Vishnu turns into a whale and swallows Manu. There's so many in our consciousness. It seems to be such a deep archetypal image of being swallowed by a whale and coming out transformed. And so in the book, I'm really looking at this idea, but also in the play and what we hope to do around supporting SETI and Moth, really around the civil work and civil society and communities of all different ages and demographics and worldviews, being able to contribute quite democratically to the future of our communion with whales. So maybe, just to say that, so Cesar and the team at Moth are working closely with Project SETI to develop with moral philosophers and legal thinkers and lawyers and legal anthropologists to build a set of ethical, like you said, moral and ethical legal guardrails that protects the future conversation we'll have with whales. So they have since the 70s, researchers have been trying to decode whale language. It's very clear that they are speaking. And like that episode people can go and see with Karen, that they can see that there is a language there, but we just haven't been able to decode it. And now recently with the use of AI, they are getting closer to doing that. So there is the possibility in 5 years, maybe in around 2030, one can imagine, this particular family of sperm whales in the Dominican Republic, where there maybe is like a floating arena, imagining there's a microphone. I sometimes imagine there's a global lottery where people can share a question worthy of their longing to bring to the whales. And there's religious leaders there, children, teachers, all kinds of people getting a chance to commune with the whales. And maybe from this dialogue, testimonies emerge that could contribute to whales accessing their own legal personhood. It's crazy to think that that's what's needed in order for them to have the legal personhood. But there's also the danger. Whales and dolphins have been used by militaries, both Russian and American militaries already. There's the danger that their language, their knowledge could become militarized and used for espionage and underwater systems with submarines, or could be commodified. And we have another kind of colonial situation where an entire culture, because they do have a culture, could be appropriated for capital gain. So what's protecting the whales from this, and what's protecting this sacred new relationship that's occurring with whales? And you speak to many indigenous people, our close friend Fire, who comes from the whale nation and the whale riders, who says that people have been communicating with whales for centuries, indigenous people, that is. So there's a lot of questions to grapple with. And so what we want to do with this play is create a play that's based on all this research, from all this kind of common, from many different cultural and spiritual backgrounds of what whales mean for people. And then what this future scenario might look like, a play set in the future, that allows for different citizens to watch the play and then participate in a citizen assembly to grapple with this. So a way to democratize that building of that ethical legal guardrails. We've got 5 years. Let's use that 5 years really well and get as many citizens from many different worldviews to grapple with what that means, so that we can compare and build something really rich, where you've got experts, legal and moral philosophical experts, which Moth and Seti are working with, and then Empatheatre can support bringing in like rich society and creating a call and response and an echolocating practice between these different knowledge systems to build something, what we like to call in Empatheatre socially robust knowledge that can manage all these different political, social, cultural, spiritual dimensions. And so that's the goal with the play, that will hopefully have really strong legal backing. And I met Cesar through Professor Elisa Morguera, who's now the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and Climate Change. We created the One Ocean Hub together, her and I and others, 180 others around the world. And so the goal would be to also try to see what emerges from this play to have kind of international policy impact around, because for her mandate for human rights and climate change, she's including more than human rights in that as well. And so the protections of whales becomes an opportunity for us to look at all kinds of protections, that these same guardrails or ethical procedures that are democratically co-created around the world has the potential to be applied for forests and for insects and for birds and even the ancestors or land itself. So yeah, while it is about whales, there's the potential that we could get swallowed in this story as humanity and come out somehow transformed. And the thing that I'm so excited about this play is this potential of what do we need to change in ourselves and to truly be able to listen and meet that, what we were speaking about earlier, that Ben Okri's double-sided axe, like what will cut into us and change us when we do this work with whales. And it feels almost, I mean, I can get quite esoteric, but it feels almost like a prophecy, you know? Why have so many cultures been talking about stories of people being swallowed by whales and coming transformed, becoming prophets in when they return, when they get spat out? Even Pinocchio, he becomes real through this process and heals his relationship with his father. I feel like there could be a way in which humanity changes after this process. I don't want to sound too grandiose about this or even myopic, but I do think there is something really exciting that is coming out, and we got to participate in a citizen assembly together, and it was remarkable what just asking these questions does to a group of people. So yeah.
Oh my gosh, there's so much to love in this. I do think, by the way, that is the power of citizen assemblies. It's how you're changed through the process of inquiry versus even just the outcome itself. That question, like if we could truly speak to whales and other beings, what would be required of us? That has really, really stuck with me, because it's it's such important humility of like, well, who do we need to be? And I remember in that council that we participated in, I noted down some of the things that our co-participants spoke about. And one was like, well, maybe whales have protocols of conversation that, you know, in the same way that when you're after human, it's like, hello, how are you? And, you know, you have a little bit of like, precursor. It's like, well, what are the conversational protocols? And I think you were the one who said something that I loved, which is, what's the stance of a student listening to a great teacher? So it's almost like, yes, maybe we're looking at them at eye level, but maybe not. Maybe, these are the elders of the earth, and we have to come, slightly bowed and deeply humble and in that kind of stance. And something else I love that people said was, what's that book? Are we intelligent enough to know the intelligence of other animals, or how smart other animals are, right? But I saw that in a bookstore, my favorite bookstore. And it's like, we love to look at forms of intelligence that other beings exhibit and say, look at how smart they are, because it's like what we can do. They can like do problem solving things, or they have memory. But obviously this planet is filled, and this is what the podcast also covers, like with so many types of intelligences. And who are we to say that our markers of intelligence are, the top dog? And so I loved this heuristic that someone shared in that workshop, which was, so yes, let's look for likeness, but let's also look for divergence. And actually, where in their difference are they teaching us other things? I'm curious, what else comes to mind for you when you think about like what would be required of us if we are and when we are to speak back to whales or other species, or converse, let's say, in ways that we're not already conversing, with all of those caveats, obviously.
Mm. I mean, just to go on that thing about difference, there's a beautiful book by Alexis Pauline Gumps called Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals. And there's, that's so profound, of also a kind of field of hydrofeminism. I'm part of a network here called the African Hydrofeminists.
Hydrofeminism. That's a new one. That's great.
You would love this. I mean, it feels like a nymph naiad story. But my PhD student, who I midwifed, she, Anya Martin, she's amazing brown African hydrofeminist who really is thinking a lot about intersectionality with the more than human. And so Alexis Pauline Gums and Dr. Joanne Piers are thinking also how actually working with the more than world, and in this case with marine mammals, in Alexis' case, actually helps a lot of political work around Black Lives Matter, around thinking about intersectional kind of activism and intersectional environmentalism. So this practice of seeing the other, like Derrida says, when you see the eyes of the other, you can't help but to act with more love. It's like what happens with social media and the internet, is that we're not fully experiencing the full affect of the other, and we're therefore becoming more colder in these social interactions. I think the thing that I get really excited about what we could change is I think a lot about whale anatomy that allows them to communicate. So I had a dream a long time ago when I was in my early 20s I met this translucent whale, which I later discovered is a mythical whale in Japanese culture. But in the dream, this whale had this diamond heart and was when I was going through deep heartbreak. And the diamond, I was so worried I was going to have like a leathery, jaded heart after losing my partner. And what I discovered was that it was showing me that my heart was getting harder, but it was becoming more multifaceted and more transparent and clear. And this kind of transparent being that whales are actually exists when they echolocate. So we see the world mainly by boundaries that light touches. So we've created things like nouns and pronouns and object-subject divides in our rationality, in our discourse, in education and in science, because we're so sighted and we rely on light touching objects, bouncing off, giving us color and shape and form. But whales, although they have that, so they can meet us there, but I think they could take us deeper because they can see in sonar. So they see in sound, or they hear in sound, but they make images in sound, like an ultrasound of seeing a baby in a womb. So I like in my imagination to imagine being a whale, seeing another whale. They are transparent and translucent, and you have agency to kind of decide how deep or how shallow you want to look at your friend or your lover or your mother, that you can see their heart beating. You can see their spleen. You can watch the progression of a baby growing inside your sister's belly, because you can penetrate into each other. You're also living in a world that is dynamic and water and fluid and porous. And so I think being a whale it's so different to being a land creature in that you don't exist with the same level of boundary that we have created as humans. So I'm very interested in in their culture, how they understand questions around identity or selfhood. And there's some research that's showing that maybe some of these things that we are misinterpreting as names, because they do have names for each other, it seems like, it's also the possibility that it sounds more like how they shift in relation to each other, that they're actually names for relationships, not for individuals. So there's a name for like Dill Alexa when they get together. And then there's a name for like when my little dog Pearl's lying there, Pearl Dill. And so they might be naming relationships more than they're naming individuals. And it's also helps with the evidence around mass strandings, is that to lose one part of the whole is so devastating for a group that they would just all rather die than live without that part of them, their community. It's also how it's so easy to capture orcas in the wild, young orcas, because they'll never leave each other's side. It's quite tragic and painful, but there's a way, this kind of selflessness that exists in whale society, I think, has a lot to teach us. And also this way of becoming transparent, which is really strange, because one of the last letters my godmother, my most important teacher, left me and her daughter after she died, was a letter about developing a way of becoming transparent, developing a transparent being. And so I feel like there's clues along the way for me, at least as a researcher, spiritual keys and visual keys, and then kind of intellectual keys, that I think whales will help us become more transparent to each other, transparent in our politics, transparent in our law, and transparent in how we relate to each other. I think there's something really in that, which I get really excited by, and I want to try explore in the play.
On the language piece, right? Having names not for individuals but for relationships. It makes me think that I think in a similar way, many indigenous languages don't have a word for me or you, or I or it, and they don't also have words for certain things. And I wonder if in the decoding, or let's say the translation of these whale languages, if the scientists are pulling from those vocabularies and, let's say, structures of native languages that might be more similar to the whales than, let's say, English or a Latin language or something of the sorts, because they probably would mimic the way the natural world works more than, the alphabetized language, which is obviously what we're speaking in now. So I wonder about that. And in terms of the decoding, if it sort of also revalorises some of the native science.
I was just thinking in Nguni languages, so in Xhosa or Zulu, here in South Africa, language is so wonderful because you don't have words that are like placed in a sentence. You have words that grow out from either end. So you'll have words that just get longer in relation to, so sentences kind of grow on in either direction like this. And it's very similar to that also around, there's so many noun classes in Zulu. For example, there's different kinds of nouns based on their relationality, just that point you were saying. So, and in Xhosa too, like the ocean, ulwandle, like that's in our play, ulwandle falls in the same noun class as Ubuntu, which Ubuntu is an African philosophy word for kind of a practice of I am because you are. I exist because you exist. Ocean, ulwandle, umoya, air, they all fall in the same noun class as Ubuntu. So the ocean is not seen as a noun, as an object. It's seen as a relationship. So I think you answered something really important there. When we start speaking with whales, I'd much rather have a Zulu speaking person speak to a whale for the first time than I would someone speaking English, because I think we're going to get in our own way a lot. And I can already see, when I read the research, I can see the kind of human bias that we're placing onto what we're interpreting from the research around whale language. I think we're stumbling quite a bit because we're using still subject-object divides. We're still thinking that we are considering whales might even understand, that the nouns don't work in the same way.
That could be a scene in the play where like different languages are translating the whale thing differently, and you could really, and that like branching thing. I know I've said it to you before, and I won't get into it now because I don't have the time. But Robert Bringhurst's Tree of Meaning, where he speaks about languages and myths and stories as these ecologies, as these branching forest tree-like structures. People, if they're watching the video, it's like from the center grows out a story or a word. And languages being these living beings. I absolutely love that. We are nearing the end, but there's just one or two more things I really must get to. I know time is flying by. We're alluding to it a little bit now, but if we stay in like the watery realm of the fish, and this sense of like these different organs of perception, and so the ways that the sperm whales have this big melon thing and they emit sonar, and what's it like to have that in your body, and Goethe also speaks, right, about these like sense of organs of perception and what do they awaken in us. Maybe you could briefly touch upon, you have this awesome paper called Growing a Lateral Line for Slow Science. And just sort of briefly, you describe that fish have a thing called a lateral line, which are canals along the sides of their bodies. And that allows them to maintain distance from each other optimally. They don't bump into each other, but they synchronize. And so you're looking at the possibility that fish can be teachers of science in a way. And this is a very life worldy thing. And so maybe just, could you touch upon like, what would science look like, or scientific practice, if it was more akin to like a shoal of fish with its lateral lines? How would science be done differently?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this. So just to say a shout out to Viv Bozilic and Anya Martin, who I wrote that paper with. They're just amazing hydrofeminists. So yes, so this idea that, like you say, Goethe says, we can develop new organs of perception. Every phenomenon encountered develops a new organ of perception in ourselves. So just watching a bird, you kind of develop an bird organ of perception through your imagination and your intuition and your observation, attentiveness. So we explore this, and I've always wondered, like, if I had a lateral line, how would my life be different? And they have this exquisite practice, which we call in the paper distance touch, where you can get really close to each other but not touch, and through this lateral line, you're able to sense the density of the water between you, that you're able to move in unison. So it allows a whole shoal of fish to make a decision together equally. It's a kind of democracy we just don't have at the moment. You sometimes see it in like the Occupy movement. They developed ways of making decisions collectively quickly. But I think it's ironic that we call it a slow science, because what it does is it slows us down to each have a contribution to a collective decision, and to kind of a citizen science approach to thinking together. So imagine a school of humans. Imagine if we were able to sense each other, to call and respond in the thick present, to make micro adjustments. So that's where the slowness comes, is that even though it looks very fast, everyone's making a slight micro adjustment to a direction. And then that ripples through the shoal of fish, and you're able to avoid a predator. So we're thinking in the paper around how could our practice around science change, where we're not just responding to one data set, which at the moment is kind of academic rigor, but we're also incorporating political rigor, cultural rigor, spiritual rigor, ethical rigor, emotional rigor into our collective decision making, and then making micro adjustments towards a better future, and applying that knowledge, that truly socially robust knowledge, And it's kind of what we do in Empatheatre. We're creating this space where collectives are able to democratize the analysis of data through public storytelling and call and response and echolocation. So in that paper, we just imagine what it would be like. And we make physiological drawings. We play with the science of the aesthetics of science, and we make these physiological and anatomical drawings of people with this line and trying to understand what it would be like. But what it does is I think a lot of how science has influenced decision making is that it's so future oriented that science can the decision making wants us to create sustainable development goals for 30 years in the future. I don't think that's the way we should be making decisions. There's a reason why COP keeps failing, why so much environmental policy fails, is that we rather need systems, kind of new educational scientific theories that allow us to make micro adjustments in the present moment to collectively, more democratically, will allow us to kind of shoal like fish in a better way. Because the objects, the predators, the complexities we're trying to avoid as a collective now are just getting more and more complex and are coming at a faster rate. So in a way, it's trying to slow down how we relate to each other in order to make quicker decisions. So it's this kind of slow, it's what Bayo Komolafa says, in The Height of Urgency, we need to slow down. For us, this was a way of thinking, how might we slow down through relational practices and developing this kind of distance touch?
Well, two responses come to mind. The first is a memory of I was just snorkeling one morning and this one little fish was in front of my mask and he just like wouldn't leave my side, and just like everywhere I turned and went, he just like followed with me. And after an hour I was like, okay, I have to get out the water now and we're very far from where I met you, so I hope that you find your way home. But also this loyalty to the mat, like, you know, in that case I was his or her shoal of fish, but this like sweet loyalty. On a more sort of serious tone, I've been reading and thinking a lot about like mass migration and movement ecology, and both of humans and other species. And you know, the idea of mobile protected areas is not new, but it's this much more dynamic sensing global system across all scales that we need in order to respond to the shifts that are completely unprecedented in our lifetimes and nonlinear, and they exacerbate each other. And so, you know, that sense and respond dynamic, I think we can also think about it in terms of how we do conservation, or how we, as you mentioned, like do political discourse and so on. Dil, in your own journey, maybe you can touch on, I'm sure it could be a very long narrative, but I'm curious what's been an encounter that has most radically unsettled your perspective of the world. What just maybe that I'm sure there's several, but like what comes to mind in terms of your own deep perspective shift?
I think my most radical encounter has actually been the dogs in my life, to be honest. I feel like the beings that have really shifted my perspective of reality have been dogs. I was raised by a pack of 6 dogs I grew up with, and I just found the way that they lived in the world so extraordinary, and how loyal they were to me, to each other. That was the first thing that came up in mind, and I've never not had a dog by my side in my life, and so I would say, yeah, trying to understand. I was a very awkward, weird child, and I didn't, queer kid in South Africa as the country was changing. It was a really complex time. The most solid way in which I made meaning in the world was trying to speak and encounter my dogs. So yeah, I had a dog called George. He was a Labrador cross Dalmatian that we rescued, and he was just, I don't know, he just was the most incredible teacher who helped me not be so human. You know, as a little child, I'd try like eat out the bowl with him, and I would like. My mom had to try to stop me from licking him because he would lick me, and then I'd lick him back as a little toddler. And I think that was the most transformative education I had of stepping outside myself. Obviously, there are much more other political, and I mean, I think my work with Mpume as a Sangoma, she has taught me so much of how to live differently to always be thinking about the world, living as a white South African in South Africa, to always be asking, how is this affecting a Black woman, has been a really important practice in my life. And I'm so grateful for her scholarship, as well as Anya and Joanne. The hydrofeminists have been such great teachers too, obviously. But I think that was my biggest shift as a child.
I love that. It's like we don't just need intergenerational households. We need absolutely interspecies households.
Yes. Yes.
Dill, thank you so much for your time, for all of the work you're doing in the world. As usual, I'm going to fill the page with all of the references that you've mentioned and where people can reach you. So, and maybe people will want to participate in the citizen, listening process for the whales. I'm sure there'll be a way that people can reach out. We can put that in the show notes. For now, have a beautiful day.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
So there you have it. Hopefully coming soon to a land near you. In the show notes, there's a link right at the top to the public page for engagement on the whale echolocation research. And just to close, I have a few main takeaways from this all. The first one is the potent role of theatre and art practices in awakening our perception, in helping people to become more ready to be disrupted, opened, and changed. Second one is that empathy is a creative act. It's imaginal, it's embodied, and it's deeply capable of reshaping how we relate and decide things together. The third one kind of follows on from that, and it's that empathy, when it's practiced collectively in this way, becomes its own form of governance. It becomes a way of listening that really reshapes how decisions are made. And finally, empathy is not about agreement, but it's about creating a vessel that's strong enough to hold our differences whilst keeping us in relationship. So that's it from me for now. I will see you in a few weeks' time. And in the meantime, I highly, highly recommend you as always to check out the show notes and to delve into this work more deeply. Over and out. Thank you for being here.